What's up everybody, this video on the Anatolian Hunter Gatherers will tell the story of the earliest people in Anatolia. One of the most active parts of all of human history. At the intersection of Eurasia, not too far from Africa and the Levant, it would be key in the rise of the Fertile Crescent. And this video will pull from a ton of different peer-reviewed articles, covering everything from the Ice Age climate, the earliest of their tools, and even how around 20,000 years ago they were taking the first steps towards plant domestication. There's even really interesting cave art which lines up with the first domesticated animals, and would become the Anatolian Neolithic Farmers, one of the most influential people on all of European history. From their technology down to things like their genes, this is the area where the SLC24A5 allele developed. If you saw the video on the development of light skin, you know that's one of the most crucial alleles to the lightening of skin in Europe. Of course, the ANF people will get their own video, most likely a series of videos, but first we should lay the groundwork for the earliest people in Anatolia. And what's most shocking is how genetically consistent they are for tens of thousands of years, despite being at a crossroads. They do have influences from the Levant, from the Balkans, from the Caucasus, and the Near East in general, but even up to modern history with the invasion of the Turks, these admixtures only ever get up to around 10 to 20%. Over tens of thousands of years, Anatolians have stayed Anatolian. It's a fascinating story, so let's get into it. The story of humans in Anatolia begins well before Homo sapiens set foot in this region. During the Middle Paleolithic, so from around 250,000 to 40,000 years ago, Anatolia was home to Neanderthals, as evidenced by fossils from sites like Karen Cave in southern Turkey, and these inhabitants thrived in Anatolia's caves and limestone shelters, hunting Ice Age fauna with stone tools. By around 70,000 years ago, modern humans were on the move from Africa into Southwest Asia. Genetic evidence shows that humans left Africa at least 60,000 years ago and interbred with Neanderthals, picking up about 2 to 3% Neanderthal DNA in all non-African populations. By 45,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans had reached Western Eurasia, very likely including the Anatolian Peninsula, given its position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. As modern humans stepped into Anatolia, they would have encountered a rugged landscape of mountains, steppes, and coasts. The climate fluctuated greatly in this period. In warm interludes, forests and grasslands provided abundant game. During colder spells, glaciers crept down mountain slopes. But despite all these challenges, Homo sapiens established a foothold. And archaeological records show that by around 45,000 to 40,000 BCE, early Upper Paleolithic people occupied caves in southern Anatolia. In the Hatay region near the Mediterranean, and let's just preface here, there might be a lot of butchering of names, but like in Çatalhöyük cave, we have a rich record of these early modern hunter-gatherers. Its deposits are dated to around 41,000 to 29,000 years ago, and there are stone blade tools and personal ornaments like shell beads, all in a style characteristic to anatomically modern humans. The lowest layers show an initial Upper Paleolithic industry, gradually transitioning into the Amarian tool tradition by around 30,000 BCE. And this continuity suggests that the first Anatolian humans carried technologies and lifestyles closely related to those of the Levant, modern Syria-Palestine, where there are known to be early Upper Paleolithic cultures like the Amarian. They made bone tools, had that jewelry, and likely had rich oral traditions. Like I said in the Pygmy video, that likely gives us a look at how all humans all across the world were living, and then they're just tacking on more tech. So tight-knit social bonds, singing, communal work, stuff like that. And this emergent, more advanced technology. And the fact that we're seeing a mixing of cultures from this area really does foreshadow the fact that this is at the crossroads of different continents. Not too far from Africa, and a bridge between Europe and Asia. Something that will make this area one of the most important areas on the planet throughout all of human history. But let's zoom in on the Ice Age setting. Through the Upper Paleolithic, Anatolian hunter-gatherers were fighting against dramatic climate swings. The period from 25,000 to 20,000 BCE coincides with the last glacial maximum, or LGM, when global ice sheets peaked. In Anatolia, the LGM brought cold, arid conditions. Pollen records from western Anatolia show that forests nearly vanished at the LGM, and tree cover dropped to only 5%. So picture a dry, steppe tundra landscape. Grasslands and patchy woodlands would have dominated, supporting herds of herbivores, but eating mostly grasses and making plant foods for humans scarce. Human groups likely retreated into special areas with milder microclimates like coastal zones or low-altitude pockets. Anatolia's Mediterranean coast remained relatively hospitable, with the sea moderating temperatures, and zooarchaeological remains support this scenario, with caves like directly in south-central Anatolia containing bones of deer, wild cattle, and ibex dated to the Upper Pleistocene, which all suggest these areas were the main human hangouts. And in southwestern Anatolia, the Belbashi-Belbidi culture sequence spans the late Upper Paleolithic into the Epi-Paleolithic after the Ice Age, and this offers a really unique snapshot of their adaptations. The toolkits from Belbashi Cave were based on tiny microlithic blades, small, sharp stone pieces that could be hafted into arrow shafts. And by the end of the Ice Age from 15,000 to 12,000 BCE, evidence shows that these Anatolian hunter-gatherers were diversifying their diets. In the Beldibi rock shelter, which was the successor to the site al-Belbashi, we see remains of coastal resources like fish and shellfish that have been discovered alongside bones of deer and wild boar, and signs of plant gathering. Grinding stones and wild grain remains all give us proof that these foragers were harvesting wild cereals growing throughout this region. And this is pretty similar to what we saw with the San people way down in South Africa, living by the coast. And if you saw that video, the main takeaway was that now that they had prime real estate, caves on the coast that were rich with seafood, while also foraging out to get some plants and other game, some researchers think this may have been the start of warfare, with bows and arrows actually being used to fish, like we see with other primitive people living today, but that these start to get used in warfare, in defending this prime real estate. So I think it's very reasonable that the same sort of thing was happening here on the Anatolian coasts, but there now is a key difference: the collecting of these wild grains and cereals, things that will be more suited for farming. Starting as early as around 20,000 BCE, this is all setting the stage for agriculture, for the Fertile Crescent that would bloom in this area. Paleo-environmental data shows that when the Ice Age waned, so about after 18,000 BCE, Anatolia greened rapidly. Forest expanded earlier here than in parts of Europe. As herb-rich meadows and woodlands returned, human populations likely grew and spread into these new areas. Remember, the trees were just down to 5% at one time. But now we're starting to uncover the traces of the late Upper Paleolithic expansions, like in northwestern Anatolia, a region that until recently had little known Paleolithic presence. But a new Epi-Paleolithic cave was discovered in 2020. Balak Cave, near Dikili in Izmir province, has given us radiocarbon dates around 12,000 BCE, showing that hunter-gatherers were active on the Aegean coast at the end of the Pleistocene. And these finds stress that Anatolian hunter-gatherers, or AHG, were not confined to a single spot. They occupied diverse habitats from the Marmara region and the Black Sea coast to the Taurus Mountains and Central Plateau. If you want to subscribe so you don't miss it, of course I will be getting into all the different people groups that emerge in this area, and there's going to be a ton of one-off videos just covering specific aspects of these cultures. I've joked in the comments before that this channel is going to end up being like seasons. We've started off in Africa, and there's still a whole lot more to cover there. But I imagine eventually I'll be doing at least tens of different videos on Anatolia, let alone when we get to Samaria and Egypt. So this whole area was what's called the AHG people group, but let's zoom in on their cultural innovations, and then we'll look at the genetics. During the Ice Age, Anatolia's foragers were creating art and ritual objects that give us a really great glimpse into their minds. In Dirikli Cave in 2009, archaeologists found a small figurine of a voluptuous female form carved in clay or soft stone. This 3-centimeter Venus figurine is stylistically similar to the famous Paleolithic Mother Goddess statue of Europe, but it is considered the first of its kind in Anatolia or the Near East. It's been dated to around 16,000 to 14,000 BCE. While the Venus of Hulfels can be dated to at least 35,000 years ago. This suggests that this kind of fertility cult or ancestral figurines, representing a woman with surplus, the opposite of famine, which threatens all species, and which is the #1 killer of offspring, idolizing this figure of abundance must have been common to human groups for tens of thousands of years, as we have it popping up in Central Europe 35,000 years ago, and 20,000 years later, we have the earliest example in Anatolia. I doubt the first one ever made was around 15,000 years ago. It's just the first one we found. People groups from Africa and Eurasia were likely all making these kinds of figures. Just like the idea of convergent evolution, that different groups are responding to the same environmental pressure, this is like the convergent evolution of ideas. That all human groups wanted their women to be fat and happy and able to produce children. And think about that this is popping up during the Ice Age. where there would be an even deeper yearning for this to be true. From the ubiquitous, enormous phallus-type sculptures to these voluptuous women, they're making real in art form what they hope to make real in reality, a kind of sympathetic magic. Anatolia also has some of the earliest known cave art in West Asia. In the Beldibi rock shelter, there are very faint rock engravings and paintings on the walls. These pictographs, showing stylized humans, mountain goats, and deer, are unique in this region, and they likely date to the Epi-Paleolithic period, so around 12,000 to 10,000 BCE, which is really interesting because it's right around the time that goats were first domesticated. Goats and sheep are thought to be domesticated before things like cattle and chickens. And so while it's not as visually elaborate as European Paleolithic cave paintings, it does show this same human impulse for creative expression. And whether it's some form of memorializing some great event, even as simple as the way a toddler will go through their day repeating the most impactful thing, or if again these are a type of sympathetic magic, the idea that drawing it or producing it out in the real world could help bring about the effect that it's portraying. This too seems to be ubiquitous across human groups of this time. And it's believed they would have had unique music and language, everything from instruments to songs that were unique to them. Of course, none of this fossilized, but it can be inferred by studying other groups. Again, like in the pygmy video, researchers can tell that certain words and instruments are believed to be from before 20,000 years ago, since they're shared across all pygmy groups, even those that later became isolated due to climate change. The pygmy lost their native language to the incoming Bantu, but they all have certain words and concepts that are unique to them, and it's thought to be from before 20,000 years ago. So again, we should expect the same thing in Anatolia, it's just that they haven't stayed the same since then. But of course, one of the most exciting and objective is the recent sequencing of ancient DNA from Anatolian Hunter Gatherers. Until a few years ago, we only had genetic data from later farmers, leaving a huge gap in our knowledge of Ice Age populations. But that changed in 2019, when scientists extracted genome-wide DNA from a man at Pınarbaşı, a rock shelter site in central Anatolia, dated to around 13,500 BCE. This Epi-Paleolithic Anatolian turned out to represent a distinct lineage of Ice Age humans, and that's what geneticists now call the Anatolian Hunter Gatherer, or AHG lineage. I stress this every time, but just because you can say everybody came out of Africa, groups eventually coalesce, and there are distinct groups both within Africa and of course outside of Africa, to the point that all people in what we call this group are more similar to each other than anybody else is to them. And so that's how we get distinct people groups. And people like the Pınarbaşı man are differentiated from other known Pleistocene groups. They are not simply an offshoot of European hunter-gatherers, nor are they identical to Levantine or Caucasus groups. They shared ancestry with these people, but became distinct in Anatolia. But of course their closest relatives are the Western hunter-gatherers, also called the Ice Age Europeans, and other Near Easterners, like people of the Levant and Caucasus. But one really interesting thing is that the AHG genomes are similar to the Villabruna cluster of Europe. The Villabruna cluster, named after a 14,000-year-old skeleton from Italy, shows the resurgence of hunter-gatherer populations in Europe after the last glacial maximum. The Anatolian hunter-gatherers' non-Middle Eastern ancestry appears most closely related to this cluster. In other words, the same genetic lineage that repopulated Europe at the end of the Ice Age also contributed to Anatolia's population. And so researchers infer that there was genetic contact between Anatolia and the Balkans, or Europe more generally, happening sometime around or soon after the LGM, and before 15,000 BCE. Whether people migrated across the Bosphorus land bridge or around the Black Sea, whatever route they took, the gene pools mixed. And this helps explain why the Anatolian hunter-gatherers are genetically similar to Balkan Mesolithic people. They share that post-LGM European heritage. But the other part of the AHG genetic profile is drawn from the ancient Near East. Genomic studies show an influence from a population related to those in the Zagros Mountains or Caucasus. This is sometimes called an early Iranian Caucasus component, and it may have entered Anatolia earlier than the European component. One hypothesis is that during the LGM, or just before it, some hunter-gatherer groups from the east, like those more habitable regions in the Caucasus, they expanded westward, bringing with them new genetic lineages. And supporting this, we have found the genome of a woman from Zudzana Cave in the Caucasus, in modern-day Georgia, dated to around 26,000 BCE, who appears ancestral to many later Near Easterners. These eastern groups carried a mysterious lineage geneticists call basal Eurasian, the base of heritage for Europe and Asia. Basal Eurasians were an early branch of modern humans that split off before other non-Africans diversified. And what's crucial is that they did not intermix with Neanderthals, so they carry none of that 2 to 3% Neanderthal signal. This deep lineage is detected in later Middle Eastern farmers, and to a lesser extent in Natufian foragers of the Levant. The Anatolian Hunter Gatherer genome shows only a small fraction of the basal Eurasian ancestry, and this aligns with its intermediate position. The AHD population had a more basal-free Western ancestry than Levantines did, but also a touch of that basal-rich Near Eastern heritage. Overall, the simplistic take is pretty accurate. They are at a crossroads, and they do have a mix of genetic heritage from the people around them, which because of its unique location, it created such a unique genome. Recent modeling of Pleistocene movement paths show that the Bosphorus was not an impassable barrier for humans. It's actually the opposite. Some of the easiest migration routes from Anatolia to the Caucasus or Eastern Europe ran across the Bosphorus and through the Balkans. This meant that groups could and did move between Anatolia and southern Europe when climate permitted. The genetic evidence for a shared Villabruna-like ancestry around 15,000 BCE is the strongest evidence corroborating this movement. And so as the Ice Age ended, people from the general area of the Balkans or Black Sea coast traversed into Anatolia, bringing new ideas and genes. They might have introduced new tool types or hunting methods, but also Anatolian groups could have migrated into Thrace and the Balkans as conditions improved there. So that by the Mesolithic, post-Ice Age, archaeological cultures on either side of the Marmara Sea show parallels. The Iron Gates culture of the Danube Valley around 9000 BCE and the Anatolian Hunter Gatherers have similar toolkits and a heavy reliance on fishing and large game, along with some shared genes. And of course, connections to the south are equally important. Bordering the Levant, the cradle of early Natufian culture, whose people settled into proto-villages by as early as 12,000 BCE, in the late Upper Paleolithic, Levantine foragers of the Quiberon industry, which was a precursor to Natufian, they likely roamed north into parts of Anatolia. Archaeologists note that the Balbashi culture in southwest Anatolia show clear ties to the Quiberon/Natufian world. Its sites were relatively stable base camps, much like Natufian camps in modern Israel, and they're both exploiting wild cereals along with coastal resources. Some even argue that the Balbashi-Beldibi groups became the first farmers of that region, just as these people in the Levant became who we call the Natufians further south. Obsidian artifacts found at Beldibi, sourced from volcanic areas of eastern Turkey, show a trade or movement across Anatolia as well. And this suggests a wide social network. Coastal foragers were obtaining volcanic glass from hundreds of kilometers away, likely via exchange with interior groups. So by around 10,000 BCE, the very end of the Pleistocene, we see a patchwork of regional cultures in Anatolia, interacting with each other and even far-off neighbors. Some caves like Okuzini and Karain near Antalya show continuous occupation into the early Holocene, showing a nice clean transition from hunter-gathering to the threshold of farming. And so the Anatolian hunter-gatherers did not live in a vacuum. They absorbed genetic influences from Paleolithic Europeans and Caucasians, and they shared cultural practices with Levantine peoples, while having trade networks of at least hundreds of kilometers. This unique position likely gave them resilience. They could draw on a broader pool of ideas and mates. And so by the end of the period we're covering in this video, from 20,000 to 10,000 BCE, you could say that Anatolia's foragers were cosmopolitan, at least in the Stone Age sense, connected to far-off peoples, influenced by far-off ideas, while of course generating tons of their own innovations, like microlithic arrows and the start of cultivating new food sources. But the key is that they're still distinct enough to forge their own evolutionary path, being genetically their own distinct AHG group. So in summary, zooming all the way back out, around 60,000 years ago, out of Africa people groups are either coming up through the Levant or across into Arabia in the Middle East, the basal Eurasians, and jumping ahead to 20,000 BCE, the late Upper Paleolithic, Anatolia was culminating in new forms of adaptation. The following millennia, from 15,000 to 10,000 BCE, often termed the Epi-Paleolithic, the descendants of those hunter-gatherers continued to develop this land. They built seasonal camps, experimented with cultivating wild plants, and were taming the first animals at this time. And one of the most mind-blowing aspects is the genetic continuity. Early Holocene skeletons around 9000 BCE show that the first farmers of Anatolia were overwhelmingly descended from the local AHG populations, with only minor inputs from outside groups. They even dated skeletons from across an area in western Anatolia, which shows across the thousands of years of different skeletons, they're all the same AHG DNA. Tens of thousands of years of Anatolians. And I've mentioned in other videos that even with the conquering Turks, the land is called Turkey. At a cultural level, everything from the language to the art, the religion of Islam, came with this conquering force, but still only a minority of the genetics of these people are Turkish. Even today, they're simply described as Anatolian. It really is incredible that they're staying so genetically similar for so long, while still undergoing massive cultural transformations. From living in caves and rock shelters, to building some of the world's first villages, and having what is at least tied, if not the first domestication of cattle, sheep, and goats, and pioneering the cultivation of wheat and barley, kicking off what would become the Fertile Crescent that would forever change the history of the rest of the world. There's a ton of stuff I touched on in this video that I will do a way deeper dive into in future videos, so subscribe if you don't want to miss that. And please hit that like button, it really is the best way to help me out. But thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one. Ben, no. Ben, what is that face? We're here, we're talking about the Anatolian Hunter Gatherers. They are one of the most